Okay, so one of the questions I get all the time, Seestar or Dwarf III? And sometimes as well, Seestar S30 or Dwarf III? Which should you choose? Oh, by the way, I finally got the case that comes with the Seestar S50. If any of you guys were interested, nice case, works well. Anyway, let's go back to the problem at hand. If you're buying a budget smart telescope, there's really three big candidates these days. There's the Seestar S50, there is the Seestar S30, and then there's the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III. And I've already reviewed and compared the Seestar S50 and the Seestar S30, and as it stands, the Seestar S50 is clearly superior. The only advantage really that the Seestar S30 has is the wider field of view together with a lower price. This little white dude here is $350 US. The Seestar S50 is $500 US, and so is the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III. By the way, of course, as usual, I'll have all of the links down in the description if you're interested in buying any of these. And so because of that, and due to the similar price between the S50 and the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III, I will be comparing mostly these two behemoth compared to the smaller S30 that we have here. Now, it comes first to a difference in specifications. We have the Seestar S50 that uses a full HD sensor, the 462. It's an older type of sensor, but it also pairs that with a 250 millimeters focal length and a 50 millimeters aperture, which means that in theory it can capture quite a lot of details. The Dwarf Lab Dwarf III uses a 678 sensor. It's a larger sensor for a larger field of view with smaller pixels for more resolution, but it is paired with only 35 millimeters of aperture, meaning that it has limits to what it can resolve compared to the Seestar S50. And also this is paired with a focal length of 150 millimeters, which means that the Dwarf III has a much wider field of view in practice than the Seestar S50 or even the Seestar S30 here. And at the same time, the Seestar S50, with its sensor and focal length, is able to have a better pixel scale, meaning capture more details, than the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III. So at this stage, it seems like the Seestar S50 has the advantage. And we'll look at the actual field of views later, because then when you look at the field of view, it might look like the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III has the advantage. Now let's talk a bit about the configurations in which those smart telescopes can be used. In terms of official support for the Seestar telescopes, whether it is the S50 or the S30, they are only usable in what is called an alt-azimuth mode, which means that they can rotate in this direction and also move the arm with the lens up and down. The Dwarf Lab Dwarf III can absolutely do that as well. And I just need to set it up like that. And you see, in this case, it's able to move also to the left and the right horizontally and then vertically to point at its target. So that's something that both the Dwarf III and the Seestar S50 can do. The big advantage of doing this like horizontal plus vertical movement is that it's very easy to set up. You just plop the telescope down, turn it on, and then you're good to go for your night of observation or imaging with those telescopes. But there is something that the Dwarf III can do. It is an equatorial mode, which means that we can actually point it so that this axis there is pointing towards the celestial North Pole or the celestial South Pole if you're in the Southern Hemisphere and you're upside down. And that has a lot of advantages. In terms of disadvantages, it takes more time to set up, but the Dwarf III has a routine to do that and really help you. It takes 5 minutes and then it's done. But after that, to track stars moving in the sky, the Dwarf III only needs to move this motor here, meaning it can take longer exposures, and it also doesn't suffer for something called field rotation, which I have shown the impact of in my previous video of the Seestar S30 compared to the Seestar S50, but I'll go back to it in a moment. This equatorial mode for the Dwarf III makes a huge difference, and it turns it more into an astrophotography platform than the Seestar S50 is, in my opinion. That said, the Seestar S50 offers features that can make this distinction a bit less relevant. In particular, it can use mosaics to try and frame a target and remove any hint of field rotation. And so despite its smaller field of view, it can use mosaics to cover the entirety of M31, the Andromeda Galaxy, for instance, or M42 plus the Running Man, so the Orion Nebula and the Running Man, within something that normally would be outside of its field of view, plus affected by field rotation. But with the mosaic mode, it manages to counter all of that at the cost of signal to noise ratio. But we'll look later in this video at detailed results of images taken with the Seestar S50 and with the Dwarf 3 on the same night at the same time. Now let's talk a bit more about software. There's a design choice difference that is considerable between two approaches for the Dwarf Lab and for the Seestar. The Seestar is more point and shoot type of thing. Basically, I can turn it on, connect the app to it, tell it what to image, and it will go there and do its imaging. I have nothing more to do effectively. Extremely streamlined. And to show you a bit how it looks like on my app, I have the Seestar turned on, and while it is during the day, we're not going to be able to do any astrophotography. To show you how it would work is I would just go to stargazing, select a target, click on go gazing, and that's it. That's all I need to do. It will find the object, slew to it, find it, center it, do autofocus because I've set it up like that, and then start doing image enhancing. Extremely easy. You also can use the Sky Atlas where you can see your field of view. And you can also set your framing with your mosaic to say like, oh, I want to actually use this field of view. I want to have like that angle on my target. And then once you're ready, you can actually tell it to go there and it will go there and just work its magic. It's very, very impressive. At the same time, it will save every subframe that it takes because it basically takes 10-second exposures over and over and over and again, and then it stacks them to create a final image. It will save both the individual subframes in JPEG and in RAW format if you tell it to do so, as well as a final image, both in JPEG or as a stacked image, which is in a linear format, so you can do a full amount of processing on that final stacked image, and stacks very, very well. And for mosaics in particular, I like to just use the stack direct out of the Seestar because I'm too lazy to stack my own mosaics, even though it is possible to do with the raw frames saved by the Seestar. The Seestar's raw frames are already dark calibrated, so that's very easy to stack. You don't need to think about darks at all. And for any color calibration purposes, they're also plate solved in a way that both like PixInsight or serial processing softwares can actually understand, which makes things a little bit easier, to be honest. It's also to be noted that by default, the Seestar S50 will only save the frames that it has managed to stack, but you have a new mode called continuous shooting that lets you do more than that as far as I understand it. Okay, so you can see the Seestar has a philosophy where it's very easy to use, very streamlined. It's something that is excellent for beginners. What about the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3? The Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3 has more options. You can set the exposure time. The Seestar can do it as well, but the Dwarf 3 is like, it's more obvious that you can and should in fact choose your own exposure time between 10 seconds effectively, or actually between fractions of a second, and 60 seconds or 45 seconds, depending on the mode. You can also choose your gain, the gain of your sensor, which is not something that you can really do with the Seestar. You can choose how many images you want to stack. It also has a mode where you can take dark frames for your Dwarf 3 and then reuse them when you do your stacking. You have also a mode to help you set up the Equatorial mode, which I have shown you on the channel before. It can also go to target and take images of them. It can also autofocus, but it's not like a fully automated flow like we have with the Seestar S50. One of the things that the Dwarf 3 has that as of recording this video, the Seestar S50 does not have, it is a planning mode where I can tell it, and I have told it to basically slew to M31, the Andromeda Galaxy, for the first 2 hours of the evening and take the pictures of that. And then go to M42, the Orion Nebula. This time use your dual band filter, which is internal to the Dwarf 3. Both of those telescopes have the same effectively filters within them. And then go for the Christmas Tree Nebula and do the rest of the evening. It's a super, super cool feature that I've also featured on the channel. I have all of the links down in the description. So to show a bit how this works, you of course have the schedule feature, which I've already featured on the channel. And then you can go inside the settings of the Dwarf 3, go to the Astro mode, because this is what I typically use. And then in there, you have something like function. And you can say like, okay, let's take some dark frames. Or let's go and set up the Equatorial mode. Or let's calibrate the Dwarf 3 so it knows where it is pointed on the sky. Let's have a look at the settings, and we can say like, oh, we want to save as FITS files, and you want that many, and you want stacked FITS files, and you want to use the full sensor resolution, etc., etc. It's a lot of stuff that you can do, and of course you also have access to the Sky Atlas, where you can view your field of view and say like, oh, okay, maybe I want to take an image here of this nebula, for instance, or that nebula here. So overall, you can see that the Dwarf III has very similar features, but they're not as streamlined. If anything, it has more features. The only feature it doesn't have that the Seestar has right now is mosaics, but it's planned to be added to the Dwarf III. But overall, you can see a difference in philosophy. The Dwarf III, as an astrophotographer, amateur astrophotographer, I kind of like the approach. I like being able to use equatorial mode. I like having the power over gain and exposure as an integral part of the flow. I like having access to the planning feature. And the only thing that I'm missing right now is a mosaic feature. So that's what I really like about the Dwarf III, but it also makes it less friendly for beginners compared to the Seestar S50 that is definitely more beginner friendly. And then there's, of course, the actual results that you get out of both telescopes. How do they measure compared to one another? And that is what we are going to have a look at right now. Before we do that though, if you want to help the channel out and help me do this kind of review comparisons, etc., because it is a lot of work, you can go and like the video. It really helps the channel out. And you can also leave a comment down below about, which one would you go for if you went for one of the smart scopes, or are you allergic to smart telescopes, which is fine as well. Let us know down in the comments. While you're going down there, if you're new to the channel and you like this kind of video, you may consider subscribing. And if you want to help even more at no cost to you, and you're planning on buying anything from Agena, High Point Scientific, Amazon, ZW, Dwarf Lab, that kind of stuff, if you do so after clicking the links that I have down in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. If you want to actually sponsor the channel and make this channel possible, you can join the channel as a member using the join button next to the subscribe button, or you can join my Patreon as a paid supporter, and the link is down in the description. My channel members, my Patreon supporters, you make the difference. You make this channel possible, and you are the real MVPs, the sponsors of this channel. Thank you so much for your support. With that, let's go inside and have a look at the results of those two telescopes, one against the other, during the same night, at the same time, on the same targets. Let's go! So first, let's look at the field of view difference between the Seestar S50, S30, and the Dwarf III. And this is what we can see. Basically, in red, you have the Seestar S50. This is the native field of view, which expands by a factor of 2, basically, for when you're using mosaics. Then we have in green, this is the Seestar S30. You can see that now we can contain the entirety, almost, of Andromeda Galaxy. And the widest field of view that we have is this blue thing, which is our teal, I guess, which is the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III. And it's very interesting to also notice that the Dwarf III has a resolution per pixel, or a pixel scale, of 2.75 arcseconds per pixel. This is compared to 2.4 for the Seestar S50, so for much more details on the Seestar S50, and to a pixel scale of 4 arcseconds per pixel on the Seestar S30, the green one. So the Seestar S30 can definitely see far fewer details than either the S50 or the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III. And again, if you're interested, I have a video about the S30 versus the S50, and the link is going to be down in the description. So that's in terms of the field of views. But again, both the S30 and the S50 have a mosaic mode that can expand those at the cost of signal-to-noise ratio. The Dwarf Lab Dwarf III doesn't require it that much because of the native large field of view that it has, but it currently does not have a mosaic mode, even though one is planned for this telescope. It's also to be remembered that if you do not use the mosaic mode, this red square, if you take an image of a target for a few hours, it's actually the real field of view is actually a circle inscribed within this red rectangle. And same thing for the Seestar S30. Your real field of view after field rotation, due to the alt-azimuth mode of the telescope, is the inscribed circle to that green rectangle. The Dwarf III, it's going to be the same if you use it in alt-azimuth mode. Even so, you get a really large field of view for that like inscribed circle to the teal rectangle. But if you use it in equatorial mode, you do not lose any field of view, although I have noticed that the Dwarf III tends to dither by a lot, and there is a movement between exposures to avoid things like walking noise, etc. So we lose some field of view at the bottom and on the sides of the field of view, something to keep in mind. If you're interested in the amount of loss in terms of field of view for a given Seestar S50 image, for instance, across several hours of imaging, this is the final image that I had gotten on the Pac-Man Nebula. And it looks fine at first glance, but if you zoom in, and we can even put it full screen, you can see that those corners, even like there's this really weird magenta band here, and the signal to noise ratio worsens. We get a lot more noise as we get to the corners. And we can see the same thing at the bottom as well. It even consumes a little bit of the nebula that was my target. And we can actually picture that using the PixInsight stack process. This basically shows us in black the area where we have the full signal to noise ratio for the capture. And the wider we get, the worse the signal to noise ratio is. That is the impact of field rotation that you get by using an alt-azimuth mount, and something that the Seestar has to use mosaic modes to sacrifice signal to noise ratio to counter, and that the Dwarf 3 can counter natively using Equatorial mode. Now let's look at some out-of-the-box results. On the left-hand side, those vertical images are from the Seestar S50, both of them using mosaic mode. On the right-hand side, it is the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3, and all of those are straight out of telescope effectively. Although I have applied Graxpert to both images on the left for the Seestar, so to remove the gradient, the background gradient. If we look at the actual JPEGs created by the Seestar, this is the end result. We had M42 for around 3 hours as a mosaic, so this is what we get straight as a JPEG. And we had M31, the Andromeda Galaxy, again as a mosaic, this time for roughly 1.5 hours. This is the result of the JPEG. Okay, what about the Dwarf 3? The Dwarf 3, it's very interesting, and it is actually a drawback to it. The stacked images, even the raw ones, the ones in FITS format, are pre-stretched. The FITS file that I get is exactly the same thing as the JPEG file, and I don't have access to the linear data of the stack, which means I cannot do things like spectrophotometric color calibration. That is critical for such images. I've told Dwarf Lab about that. They're saying that they will make an update where we can choose to record our stacked frames in a linear state to match the Seestar. And I can prove it to you. I can show you how the actual frames look like for all of those 4 images that are straight out of the telescope. And you can see the Seestar ones are dark, meaning they are linear images, compared to the Dwarf Lab that are not dark. So that's a drawback for the Dwarf Lab, which means I basically never use those out-of-the-box stacks of the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3. I prefer to stack myself using either Cyril, Deep Sky Stacker, or PixInsight, and you can see the results. Those are the results of stacks. They are linear images that we can finally work with. And both of those are after Graxpert, so removing the background, and also spectrophotometric color calibration to get the results, to get the right star colors in both images. So now we get something very similar across those 4 images. Now, with those results that have exactly for the moment the same basic pre-processing applied, if I zoom in to the same area of the Andromeda Galaxy, so let's open that up a little bit more, and same for the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3. On the left, we have the Seestar S50. On the right, we have the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3. And while the orientation is not the same, look at this asterism of stars here. It is the same as that one here. And we can notice that in the dust bands, the Seestar clearly, even though it uses mosaic mode, has better details. It has managed to capture more details than the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3 has. We can also see, with roughly the same level of zoom between the 2 telescopes, that the Seestar stars are a bit tighter than the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3 stars. So the Seestar S50, due to its longer focal length, but also I believe to be better optics, definitely has the advantage in terms of the details that it's able to capture on M31. Absolutely 100%. Now, what happens to this M31 for both of those images once I process it using my standard processing workflow on both of those images. So on the left again, we have the results of the Seestar S50 for the same amount of time spent on this target, and on the right, we have the result of the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III in equatorial mode. And if I zoom into the dust lanes, for the same dust lanes, again, we can see that the Seestar S50 definitely has captured more details. I mean, look at the definition of this little arm here, which is the equivalent of that arm there for the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III. The Seestar definitely manages better. But in terms of the overall image, especially when it comes to the outskirts of the galaxy, the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III has managed to capture more details in those areas. I mean, look, compare this here to that there. It's completely different in terms of the amount of details that we can see. So the edge overall, I prefer my image of M31 taken with the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III to the one taken with the mosaic mode of the Seestar S50. But it does mean that if you're going to go for small planetary nebulae, for instance like M1, the Crab Nebula, or M27, the Dumbbell Nebula, where you don't need to use the mosaic mode, and the field of rotation of the Seestar S50 doesn't bother you because it's a small target and it stays at the center of the field of view, then the Seestar would provide us with considerably better results, as we can see from the details that it manages to achieve on M31, the Andromeda Galaxy. But at the same time, in this particular example, the Dwarf III definitely has the advantage in terms of the results after final processing. What about M42, the Orion Nebula? So again, on the left, we have the Seestar S50. It's the result of a mosaic, and on the right we have the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III. Now there is a difference. The Seestar S50 was actually pointed, now that I look back at my logs, for around 5 hours on this M42 nebula with its dual band filter. The Dwarf Lab Dwarf III, as part of its planning feature, was only pointed at the same object for 3 hours. And this is basically just the image after background extraction and spectrophotometric color calibration. And we can see the same patterns. The Seestar definitely manages to get more details in this nebulosity, and especially if you look at this area of the object there, like you have more details on the left image than you do on the right image. The stars from the Seestar are more pinpoint than the stars for the Dwarf III. So again, it comes down, I believe, to better optics in general. And at the same time, though, if you look around here for both, even though the Seestar S50 had more imaging time in total, I do believe the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III has a better signal-to-noise ratio, which kind of makes sense. So we are again seeing the positives and negatives of both telescopes. Let's look at the final image of each processed by me so that we can look at the final result. So again, on the left we have the Seestar S50 compared to, on the right, the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III. If I zoom into the core of the nebula, you can see the Seestar S50 barely manages the trapezium, which is very interesting. The Dwarf III also manages to show us the shape of the trapezium, but definitely with fewer details. And again, the nebulosity, the S50, has simply more details overall than the Dwarf III is able to manage. At the same time, the Dwarf III definitely has more field of view, and if you look at this area there, you can see that the Seestar struggled a bit more with getting that faint nebulosity compared to the Dwarf III, despite having been given so much more time compared to the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III. Still, either of those images, I mean, they come from $500 smart telescopes. How insane is that? The hobby has changed so much in the past few years. To me, it's absolutely insane that we can get those results out of such cheap telescopes. And we notice also, of course, that despite using mosaic mode for the Seestar S50, the Dwarf Lab Dwarf III still has the larger field of view, and we can start seeing the nebulosity basically going off of the main nebula. So with that, we see all of the differences between the Seestar and the Dwarf III. And so which should you buy if you're looking for a smart telescope? Should you go for the ZW Seestar S50, are for the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3. There's also something else to consider, by the way. It's the availability. The Seestar S50 is much easier to buy right now than the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3, which is victim of its own success and has a long waiting list, effectively. So that's also something to keep in mind. But going purely from the products themselves, the answer is, it depends. Obviously, it really depends on what you want to achieve. The Seestar S50 is much larger, but can achieve better results in terms of details that you capture. The Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3 is much smaller and lighter. It's great to go hiking with, and it has all of those cool features like Equatorial mode, planning modes, and the ability to choose your gain, exposure lengths, etc. At the same time, the software of the Dwarf 3 is less streamlined than the software of the Seestar S50 or the Seestar S30 for that matter. But personally, if you ask me which one do I use more, I tend to use the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 3 more simply because of its small size and the Equatorial mode together with the planning mode. In fact, I had so much fun with the planning mode that I spent actually several nights imaging M31 followed by M42 followed by the Christmas tree cluster. And spending 3 nights on those, I can actually show you the result. This is the result on M31 across 3 nights, each night roughly 1.5 hours of data. This is from Tokyo, Japan, one of the most light polluted cities on Earth. So not too bad, right? And the Orion Nebula, so now it's 3 nights of 2 hours roughly, or 2 to 3 hours each, roughly on the M42 Nebula. And again, this is from a smart telescope? That's insane! And yeah, I absolutely love this result as well. And we do see the nebulosity, including that little finger there, streaming away from the main nebula body. I think this is so cool to be able to achieve this. And then also during those 3 nights, the very end of the night, for 1 hour a night, I was on the Christmas tree nebula and cluster. And this is what we get. This is the cone nebula there, the Christmas tree. And this is again taken with a smart telescope. What impressive technology those smart telescopes are, seriously. In general, like regardless of whether they're the Seestar, they're the Vaonis Vespera, they're the Celestron Origin, or they're the Dwarf 3, they're amazing pieces of tech, and that can really lead more and more people into the hobby, and I absolutely love that. So yeah, Seestar S50, Dwarf 3, which would you go for based on all of that? Let us know down in the comments. While you're going there, leave a like on the video, it really helps the channel out. And if you want to help the channel even more and you're planning on buying anything from ZW, Dwarf Lab, Amazon, Agena, High Point Scientific, etc., if you do so after clicking the links I have down in the description, it helps me out at no cost to you. And if you want to sponsor the channel to really make those videos and all the work that goes into them possible, you can join the channel as a member or join my Patreon as a supporter. The link is down in the description, and my channel members and my Patreon supporters, you really directly sponsor this channel. With that, I hope this was useful. Don't forget whenever you can to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.